On November 3, 1914, a traveling salesman named Robert McIntyre stopped at a farmhouse in the mountains of West Virginia, about 15 miles from the nearest town, hoping to sell household goods to the family that lived there. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder, still nothing. But he could hear sounds from inside. Footsteps, voices, what sounded like normal household activity. He tried the door. It was unlocked. He called out, announcing himself. The sounds stopped immediately, as if everyone inside had frozen at the sound of his voice. McIntyre waited. Silence. He called out again. Nothing. Deeply unsettled, he left without entering, making the long journey back to town, where he reported the strange encounter to the local sheriff. The sheriff, along with 2 deputies, traveled to the farmhouse the next day. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The family was still inside, all 8 of them. Father, mother, and 6 children, ranging in age from 4 to 16. They were sitting at the dinner table, perfectly positioned, as if frozen in the middle of a meal. But they were all dead. They had been dead for at least 24 hours, possibly longer. And here's what made it impossible. Every door and window in the house was locked from the inside. There was no sign of violence, no sign of poisoning, no sign of any cause of death that the doctors could identify. 8 people had died simultaneously while eating dinner in a locked house, and no one could explain how or why. But the truly disturbing details emerged later. Neighbors reported that the family, the Hutchinson family, headed by Samuel Hutchinson, age 46, had not left their property in over 3 years. Not once. Not for supplies. Not for medical care. Not for church or social events that every other family in the area attended. They had become completely isolated, living entirely self-sufficiently on their remote mountain farm, refusing all visitors, conducting no business with the outside world. And in the weeks before their deaths, multiple people reported seeing strange things around the Hutchinson property at night. Lights moving in patterns that didn't correspond to lamps or lanterns, sounds that neighbors described as chanting or singing, but in no language they recognized. And on several occasions, what appeared to be the entire family standing outside their house in the middle of the night, perfectly still, staring toward the mountains as if waiting for something. The investigation into the Hutchinson family's deaths would reveal a pattern of increasingly bizarre behavior spanning 3 years, suggestions of religious mania or cult-like beliefs, evidence that the family had been preparing for something they believed was coming, and a final dinner that appeared to have been some kind of ritual. And the locked doors, the simultaneous deaths, the complete absence of any identifiable cause, all of it suggested that whatever killed the Hutchinson family, they had been expecting it, preparing for it, and had locked themselves in to ensure that when it came, no one could interfere. Before we continue with the deeply disturbing story of the Hutchinson family and the 3 years of isolation that led to their inexplicable deaths, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from, because what happened to the Hutchinson family in those mountains of West Virginia and what they believed was coming for them represents one of the most mysterious and unsettling cases of mass death in American history. West Virginia in 1914 was still a frontier in many ways, with vast areas of mountainous territory that remained isolated and undeveloped. The Appalachian Mountains created natural barriers that separated communities, with some families living days of travel from the nearest towns, maintaining subsistence farms in remote valleys and on mountain slopes where they could live for generations with minimal contact with the outside world. These isolated mountain communities developed their own cultures, their own beliefs, and sometimes their own ways of understanding the world that differed dramatically from mainstream American society. The Hutchinson family had lived in the mountains of Pocahontas County, West Virginia, for at least 2 generations. Samuel Hutchinson's father had established the farm in the 1860s, clearing land and building a 2-story wooden house in a valley surrounded by steep forested slopes. The location was remote but productive, with good soil, a reliable spring providing water, and sufficient flat land for crops and livestock. The elder Hutchinson had raised 7 children there, of whom Samuel was the third, and when the father died in 1895, Samuel had inherited the farm along with the responsibility of supporting his mother and his younger siblings who had not yet married and left. Samuel Hutchinson married Mary Catherine Dover in 1897 when he was 29 and she was 18. Mary was from another mountain family about 10 miles away, and the marriage was arranged through family connections, as was common in isolated communities where opportunities to meet potential spouses were limited. The couple had 6 children between 1898 and 1910. James, born 1898, Sarah, 1900, Robert, 1902, Elizabeth, 1905, Thomas, 1908, and Ruth, 1910. The family lived much like other Appalachian mountain families, working their farm, raising crops and livestock for their own consumption, occasionally trading with neighbors for goods they couldn't produce themselves, attending church services at a small Baptist chapel about 5 miles from their farm, and maintaining the subsistence lifestyle that had supported mountain families for generations. By all accounts, the Hutchinson family was normal, perhaps even prosperous by mountain standards, through the first decade of the 1900s. They attended church regularly, participated in community events like barn raisings and harvest celebrations, traded eggs and vegetables with neighbors, and were generally well regarded as hard-working and pious people who lived righteous lives according to the strict Baptist teachings that prevailed in the mountain communities. Samuel was known as a skilled farmer and carpenter, Mary as an excellent cook and seamstress, and their children as well-behaved and respectful, if somewhat quiet and serious beyond what would be expected for their ages. But in the summer of 1911, something changed. The family stopped attending church. When neighbors inquired about their absence, Samuel told them that God had spoken to him in a vision, had told him that the church was corrupt and false, and that true worship required separation from the world and complete dedication to preparing for the second coming of Christ, which was imminent. This was not entirely unusual rhetoric. For the time and place, apocalyptic Christianity was common in Appalachian mountain communities, and many families held beliefs about the end times that mainstream Protestant denominations would have considered extreme or heretical. But Samuel's vision went beyond typical apocalyptic beliefs. He began telling neighbors that God had revealed to him that Christ would return specifically to the mountains of West Virginia, that this region had been chosen as the site of the New Jerusalem, and that families needed to purify themselves and prepare their homes to receive Christ when he arrived. Samuel said that God had commanded him to separate his family from the contamination of worldly people, to cease all unnecessary contact with those outside his household, and to focus entirely on spiritual preparation and on making his farm and family ready for Christ's arrival. Initially, neighbors were sympathetic, or at least tolerant of Samuel's beliefs. Eccentric religious views were common enough in the mountains, and as long as the Hutchinsons weren't bothering anyone, most people felt they had the right to practice their faith however they saw fit. But over the following months, the family's isolation deepened. Samuel stopped coming to town for supplies, stopped trading with neighbors, stopped allowing his children to play with other children in the area. When neighbors visited the Hutchinson farm, they found the family increasingly withdrawn, suspicious, and hostile to outsiders. Mary Hutchinson, who had previously been friendly and sociable with other women in the community, became silent and would not speak when visitors came. She would stand behind Samuel, eyes downcast, responding only with nods or shakes of her head when directly addressed. The children showed even more dramatic changes. They had been energetic and playful when neighbors had seen them at church or community gatherings, but now they stood motionless and silent when visitors appeared, staring with what several people described as dead or empty eyes, showing no curiosity or responsiveness that would be normal for children. Several neighbors expressed concerns to the local Baptist minister, Reverend Thomas Crawford, about the Hutchinson family's isolation and about the strange beliefs Samuel was espousing. Crawford visited the Hutchinson farm in early 1912 to attempt pastoral counseling and to encourage the family to return to church. Samuel refused to let Crawford into the house, instead speaking with him outside, and the conversation quickly became heated as Crawford challenged Samuel's claim of direct divine revelation and argued that separating from the church community was contrary to Christian teaching about fellowship and mutual support. Samuel responded that the institutional church was corrupt, that ministers like Crawford were false teachers, leading people away from true faith, and that God's direct revelation to Samuel superseded any human religious authority. He told Crawford that Christ's return was imminent, possibly within months, and that when Christ came, those who had remained in false churches would be judged and found wanting, while those who had separated themselves and prepared would be saved. Crawford attempted to reason with Samuel, to point out that Christians throughout history had predicted Christ's imminent return and had been wrong, but Samuel was unmoved, insisting that God had revealed to him specifically when and where Christ would return, and that this knowledge required him to act on it even if others mocked or rejected him. Reverend Crawford left the Hutchinson farm deeply concerned about the family's spiritual and mental state, but he had no legal authority to intervene and no mechanism to force the family to remain connected to the church community. He prayed for the family, encouraged other congregants to continue attempting to reach out to the Hutchinsons, but ultimately could do nothing except watch as the family withdrew further into isolation. By the summer of 1912, the Hutchinson family had ceased all contact with the outside world. Samuel had stockpiled enough supplies that the family could be completely self-sufficient, growing all their own food, making their own clothes, using no goods or services that required interaction with anyone beyond the family. The children were removed from the informal schooling that mountain children sometimes received from traveling teachers or from educated community members, and were instead taught only by Samuel and Mary, using the Bible as their sole text. Samuel taught the children that the outside world was evil and corrupting, that contact with anyone not in the family would contaminate their spiritual purity and make them unfit to receive Christ when he returned. Neighbors occasionally saw members of the Hutchinson family from a distance, working in their fields, tending their livestock, going about the normal activities of farm life. But if anyone approached close enough to call out a greeting, the family members would immediately stop what they were doing and retreat to the house, not acknowledging the neighbor's presence or returning any friendly overtures. The Hutchinson farm became known in the area as a place to avoid, with some neighbors beginning to believe that there was something unhealthy or even evil about the family's extreme isolation. The strange nighttime phenomena began being reported in late 1912 and continued through 1913 and into 1914. Multiple neighbors whose properties bordered or had sightlines to the Hutchinson farm reported seeing unusual lights on the property after dark. These weren't normal lamp or lantern lights that would be visible from windows or that would move as someone carried a light source. Instead, neighbors described seeing multiple lights moving in coordinated patterns in the Hutchinsons' fields or woods, sometimes arranged in circles or geometric shapes, sometimes moving in lines as if in procession, appearing and disappearing in ways that didn't correspond to anyone physically carrying light sources. Several neighbors also reported hearing sounds at night coming from the direction of the Hutchinson property. Sounds described as chanting or singing, but not in English or in any language the neighbors recognized. The sounds were rhythmic and seemed to involve multiple voices, suggesting the entire family was participating in whatever nighttime activity was producing the sounds. Some neighbors described the sounds as deeply unsettling, as having a quality that made them feel frightened or disturbed, even though they couldn't identify anything specifically threatening about what they were hearing. Most disturbing were the reports from 3 separate neighbors of seeing the entire Hutchinson family standing outside their house in the middle of the night, perfectly still, arranged in a line facing toward the mountains. The witnesses described the family as being completely motionless, not speaking or moving, just standing and staring, as if waiting for something or watching for something. The sightings occurred on clear, moonlit nights, when visibility was good enough to see figures clearly from a distance, and each witness was certain they had seen all 8 family members. The distinctive sizes and shapes of adults and children of various ages made them identifiable even from several hundred yards away. One neighbor, a man named Jacob Fuller, whose property adjoined the Hutchinson farm, reported that he had seen the family standing outside on 3 separate occasions over a period of several months. On the 3rd occasion, in August 1914, Fuller had been disturbed enough by the sight that he had approached closer to call out and ask if everything was all right, if the family needed help. The moment he called out, all 8 family members had turned their heads simultaneously to look at him, but none had spoken or moved otherwise. Fuller described feeling intense fear at that moment, a sense that he was in danger, though he couldn't rationally explain why a family standing on their own property should make him feel threatened. He had retreated quickly, without approaching any closer. Fuller reported this incident to the county sheriff, expressing concern that something was seriously wrong with the Hutchinson family, that their behavior had gone beyond eccentric religious beliefs into something that seemed mentally ill or dangerous. But the sheriff, when he followed up on Fuller's report by visiting the Hutchinson farm during daylight hours, found nothing obviously wrong or illegal occurring. Samuel Hutchinson had spoken with the sheriff politely but firmly, explaining that his family was practicing their religious beliefs, as was their constitutional right, that they harmed no one, and that they should be left alone. The sheriff, having no evidence of any crime or child abuse, having no legal basis for forcing the family to interact with their community, had no choice but to leave them alone. But the sheriff, like Reverend Crawford before him, left the Hutchinson property with deep unease about what he had seen. He later reported that the family members had seemed strange in ways he struggled to articulate. They moved in synchronized ways that seemed rehearsed or controlled. They rarely blinked. Their affect was completely flat, as if they felt no emotions at all. The children in particular disturbed him, as they showed none of the normal liveliness or curiosity of healthy children, instead standing perfectly still and silent, responding only when Samuel explicitly instructed them to do something. The sheriff described having the impression that he was looking at a family that had been hollowed out, that the people he saw had become something less than fully human through whatever religious practices or beliefs Samuel had imposed on them. In October 1914, about a month before the family's deaths, a traveling peddler named William Morrison stopped at the Hutchinson farm, hoping to sell goods. Unlike most visitors who were turned away immediately, Morrison was allowed to approach the house, and Samuel actually purchased several items including lamp oil, salt, and needles. Morrison later reported that the transaction had been strange. Samuel had stood in the doorway, blocking Morrison's view into the house, and during the entire interaction, Morrison could hear movement and whispering inside, but could not see anyone except Samuel. Samuel had paid for the goods, and had then told Morrison something that Morrison found cryptic and disturbing. "You should leave these mountains before November. Something is coming, and those who are not prepared will not survive it." Morrison had asked what Samuel meant, what was coming. But Samuel had just shaken his head and closed the door, ending the conversation. Morrison reported Samuel's warning to people in town, where it was generally dismissed as more religious ranting from a man who had clearly become mentally unstable. But Morrison himself was disturbed enough by the encounter and by the atmosphere he had sensed at the Hutchinson property that he left the area earlier than he had planned, cutting short his sales rounds in that part of West Virginia and moving on to other territories. This brings us to November 3rd, 1914, and the visit from salesman Robert McIntyre that would lead to the discovery of the family's deaths. McIntyre, who had been traveling through the area and who had not heard the local stories about the Hutchinson family, had approached the house expecting a normal sales interaction. When he encountered the locked door despite clear sounds of people inside, when his calling out was met with sudden silence, he had initially thought perhaps the family was simply shy or didn't want to deal with a salesman. But something about the quality of the silence after he had called out had deeply disturbed him. He described it as feeling like multiple people holding their breath simultaneously, like a collective freezing in response to his presence that suggested fear or concealment rather than simple disinterest in buying goods. McIntyre had reported the strange encounter to Sheriff Daniel Peterson in the town of Hillsborough, the county seat, about 15 miles from the Hutchinson farm. Sheriff Peterson, who had visited the Hutchinsons several months earlier following Jacob Fuller's report, was concerned enough by McIntyre's description to organize an immediate investigation. Peterson, along with deputies Robert Marshall and Thomas Green, traveled to the Hutchinson farm on the afternoon of November 4th, arriving at the property around 2 o'clock. The scene they encountered would be seared into their memories permanently. The farmhouse stood silent and still, no smoke coming from the chimney, despite the cold November weather, no signs of any activity or movement. The deputies called out, identifying themselves and asking the family to come out and speak with them. No response. They approached the house and tried the door. It was locked. They tried the windows. All locked from inside. They walked around the entire house, checking every possible entry point, and found that every door and every window was secured from within, making entry impossible without breaking down a door or smashing through a window. Sheriff Peterson made the decision to force entry, breaking through the front door with the help of his deputies, using a piece of timber as a battering ram. The door gave way after several impacts, swinging open to reveal the interior of the Hutchinson house. The smell that emerged was immediate and overwhelming, the smell of death, of human bodies that had been decomposing in a closed space for at least a day, possibly longer. The deputies hesitated, covering their noses and mouths, steeling themselves for what they would find inside. They found the family in the main room of the house, which served as both kitchen and dining area. All 8 family members were seated at the table, positioned as if they had been in the middle of eating dinner when death had come for them. Samuel Hutchinson sat at the head of the table, Mary at the other end, the 6 children arranged along the sides in order of age from oldest to youngest. Each person had a plate in front of them with food still on it, what appeared to be bread, some kind of stew or soup, Vegetables from the family's garden. Cups were present at each place setting, containing what would later be identified as water. But every person was dead, had been dead for what the deputies estimated was 24 to 36 hours based on the state of decomposition. The bodies were still seated upright, held in place by rigor mortis that had set in while they were in those positions. Their eyes were open, staring forward at nothing. Their hands were on the table as if they had been eating when death occurred. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture or spilled food or any indication that the family members had tried to fight or escape whatever had killed them. Sheriff Peterson and his deputies carefully examined the scene, documenting what they saw and trying to determine what had happened. The house was locked from inside. They verified this by checking every door and window from the interior, confirming that all locks and latches were in the secured position, that there was no way anyone could have left the house after the family died without unlocking a door or window from inside, and there was no evidence that anyone had done so. This meant that whatever had killed the Hutchinson family had either come from inside the house or had somehow affected them without physically entering the space. The deputies searched the house thoroughly, looking for any clues about what might have caused 8 people to die simultaneously. They found no signs of violence on any of the bodies, no bullet wounds, no stab wounds, no obvious trauma of any kind. They found no suicide note, no indication that this had been a deliberate act by the family to end their own lives. They found no obvious poisons or toxic substances, though they collected samples of the food and water from the table to be analyzed later. What they did find were numerous strange elements that suggested the family had been engaged in some kind of ritual or religious practice. The walls of the main room were covered with writing, biblical verses copied out in what appeared to be Samuel's hand, but also other text that wasn't biblical, consisting of prayers or incantations that the deputies couldn't identify. Some of this writing was in English, but some appeared to be in other languages or possibly in made-up language that resembled Latin or Hebrew, but that wasn't recognizable as any actual language. On the floor surrounding the table, the deputies found what appeared to be ritual markings, circles and symbols drawn in chalk or some kind of white powder, creating geometric patterns that enclosed the table and the seated family members. These markings resembled occult or magical symbols, though neither the sheriff nor his deputies had enough knowledge of such matters to identify them specifically. The presence of these markings suggested that the family's final meal had been conducted as some kind of ceremony, that whatever belief system Samuel had developed had progressed beyond Christianity into something that incorporated ritual magic or other esoteric practices. In the upstairs bedrooms, the deputies found that the family had been sleeping in one room, all 8 people crowded into a space that normally would accommodate 1 or 2 people. The other bedroom was completely empty of furniture and had its walls covered entirely in more writing, religious verses, apocalyptic prophecies, and what appeared to be Samuel's own writing, describing visions or revelations he claimed to have received. The deputies copied down some of this writing to be analyzed later, though much of it was difficult to read, as Samuel's handwriting had become increasingly erratic and illegible. Most disturbing was what the deputies found in the cellar beneath the house. The cellar contained normal storage items, preserved vegetables, smoked meat, tools, and equipment, but it also contained what could only be described as a shrine or altar. A table had been set up with 7 candles arranged in a specific pattern, a Bible open to the Book of Revelation, and various objects that appeared to have symbolic or ritual significance, including a knife, a cup, several stones arranged in patterns, and what appeared to be animal bones carved with symbols. On the wall behind this altar, Samuel had written what appeared to be a prayer or invocation, though again, much of it was in unknown language or in such cryptic phrasing that its meaning was unclear. The deputies were able to make out a few phrases in English. "They are coming from the mountains. We have prepared. The door will open. We will be taken as we are worthy." These fragments suggested that Samuel had believed something was going to come for the family, that they had prepared for this event, and that they viewed whatever was coming as desirable, as a form of salvation or ascension, rather than as a threat. The deputies removed the bodies from the house and transported them to Hillsborough, where a physician named Dr. Robert Caldwell could conduct examinations to try to determine cause of death. Caldwell, who was the only doctor in the county and who had limited training in pathology, examined the 8 bodies as carefully as his skills and equipment allowed. His findings were puzzling and ultimately inconclusive. All 8 bodies showed no external injuries. No signs of violence or trauma. Their internal organs, examined through limited autopsy procedures, appeared normal, with no obvious pathology. Dr. Caldwell tested samples of the food and water from the table and found no evidence of any known poisons. He examined the bodies for signs of asphyxiation or carbon monoxide poisoning, but found none. Every conventional cause of death he could think of, poisoning, suffocation, carbon monoxide, disease, injury, was ruled out by his examination. Dr. Caldwell was forced to conclude that he could not determine what had killed the Hutchinson family. His official report stated that all 8 people had died at approximately the same time, that death appeared to have been relatively quick based on the positioning of the bodies and the lack of any signs of prolonged suffering, but that the mechanism of death was undetermined and possibly undeterminable with available medical knowledge. He suggested that perhaps some kind of unknown toxin or environmental factor had affected the family, or possibly some kind of collective psychological event had occurred that modern medicine did not yet understand. The investigation into the Hutchinson deaths continued for several weeks, with Sheriff Peterson and state authorities attempting to piece together what had happened. They interviewed every neighbor, every person who had had any contact with the family in the years leading up to the deaths. They examined the writings found in the house, consulting with religious scholars and with experts in occult practices to try to understand what belief system Samuel had developed and what ritual or ceremony the family might have been enacting when they died. What emerged was a picture of a family that had gradually descended into extreme religious isolation and into beliefs that combined Christian apocalypticism with elements of folk magic, possibly influenced by Appalachian folk traditions or by books or materials Samuel had somehow obtained. Samuel appeared to have believed that Christ's second coming would occur on or around November 1914, that it would happen specifically in the mountains of West Virginia, and that his family needed to be spiritually pure and prepared to be taken up or transformed when Christ arrived. The ritual markings on the floor, the altar in the cellar, the specific positioning of the family at the dinner table during their deaths, all suggested that the family had been attempting some kind of ceremony designed to make them ready for this anticipated event, to open themselves to divine transformation, or to signal their readiness to be chosen for salvation. Whether Samuel believed he was performing a Christian ritual, or whether he had moved into territory that would be considered magical or occult, was unclear, but the evidence suggested his beliefs had progressed well beyond any recognizable form of conventional Christianity. The question of what actually killed the family remained unanswered. Modern theories have suggested various possibilities. Some have argued for mass psychogenic death, the idea that 8 people, through extreme psychological stress and shared belief, somehow died through purely psychological mechanisms, essentially willing themselves to death. This phenomenon, while rare, has been documented in other contexts where people under extreme stress who believe strongly that they are going to die sometimes do die without any physical cause. Others have suggested that some form of environmental toxin affected the family, possibly carbon monoxide from improperly vented heating, possibly some kind of gas released from the ground, possibly contamination of their water or food supply by some substance that wasn't detected by the limited testing available in 1914. The locked doors could be explained if the family realized they were dying, but were too weak or disoriented to unlock doors and escape, instead remaining seated at the table as death overcame them. Still others have suggested that the family died by some form of deliberate poisoning that Samuel had orchestrated, using a substance that wasn't detected by Dr. Caldwell's tests, that the final dinner was intended as a murder-suicide to coincide with what Samuel believed was the date of Christ's return, and that Samuel had convinced his family that dying in this way would ensure their salvation. This theory is supported by the ritualistic elements and by Samuel's writings suggesting he believed transformation or ascension was imminent. But none of these theories fully explains all the evidence. Mass psychogenic death doesn't typically affect children or multiple people simultaneously. Environmental toxins would likely have produced symptoms that would be visible in the bodies, or that would have caused the family to become distressed and try to escape. Deliberate poisoning should have been detectable, and the family's positioning suggests they were not in distress when they died. That death came quickly, and perhaps unexpectedly, rather than after prolonged suffering that would accompany most poisons. The case remained officially unsolved, classified as deaths from undetermined causes in county records. The Hutchinson farmhouse was left standing but abandoned, as no relatives came forward to claim the property, and local people were too disturbed by what had happened there to want to purchase or inhabit the land. Over the following decades, the house gradually deteriorated, the wooden structure rotting and collapsing, nature reclaiming the fields that the Hutchinsons had cultivated. By the 1950s, nothing remained of the house except the foundation and some scattered timber, and even these remnants eventually disappeared, leaving only the historical record and local legends to mark where the Hutchinson family had lived and died. The 6 children who died with their parents left no legacy except as victims of their father's religious mania and their family's extreme isolation. James, the oldest at 16, had been old enough to understand what was happening and to potentially resist or escape, but had apparently been so psychologically controlled by Samuel that he could not or would not act independently. Sarah, Robert, Elizabeth, Thomas, and Ruth, ranging from 14 down to 4 years old, had been conditioned from early childhood to obey without question, to accept Samuel's teachings as absolute truth, and to view the outside world as dangerous and corrupt. They had been denied education, denied social contact, denied any opportunity to develop independent judgment that might have allowed them to recognize that their father's beliefs were delusional. Mary Hutchinson's role in the family's descent into fatal isolation remains ambiguous. She had apparently acquiesced to Samuel's increasingly extreme beliefs and practices, had participated in removing the children from school and from church, had accepted the family's complete separation from their community, but whether she genuinely shared Samuel's beliefs or whether she was psychologically dominated and controlled by him in ways that made resistance impossible cannot be determined from the available evidence. Some neighbors reported that Mary had seemed frightened and trapped in the months before the family's isolation became complete, suggesting she may have recognized that Samuel's behavior was dangerous but felt powerless to protect herself or her children. The broader community of Pocahontas County was deeply affected by the Hutchinson tragedy. Churches intensified their pastoral outreach efforts, attempting to identify and help families that were becoming isolated or that were developing extreme religious beliefs that might lead to harm. Local authorities became more willing to investigate reports of unusual behavior or of families that were withdrawing from community contact, recognizing that such isolation could be a warning sign of dangerous situations developing. But the fundamental problem that families in remote mountain locations could live in complete isolation if they chose to, that religious freedom meant people could hold and practice any beliefs they wanted as long as they didn't obviously harm others, and that identifying when eccentric religious beliefs crossed the line into dangerous delusion was extremely difficult, remained unresolved. The Hutchinson case demonstrated that tragedy could develop slowly over years in plain sight of neighbors and authorities who felt they had no legal or ethical basis for intervening until it was too late. The question of what Samuel Hutchinson actually believed, what vision or revelation had convinced him to isolate his family and to prepare for some apocalyptic event that he was certain was coming, can only be partially answered from the writings he left behind. His early writings, from the first months after he stopped attending church, were relatively coherent, if extreme in their apocalyptic expectations. He wrote about Christ's imminent return, about the need for spiritual purification, about separating from the corrupt world to prepare for divine judgment, all themes that were common in fundamentalist Christian traditions even if Samuel took them further than most. But his later writings, particularly those found in the bedroom, that had become his personal space for writing and prayer, showed increasing disconnection from reality. He described receiving detailed visions from God or from angels, being given specific information about dates and locations of prophetic events, being told that he and his family had been specially chosen for important roles in the end times. He wrote about entities or beings that were coming from the mountains, that were preparing the way for Christ's return, that would identify and transform those who had properly prepared themselves. Some of his writings suggested influence from esoteric or occult sources, using terminology and concepts that didn't come from traditional Christian teaching. He wrote about opening doors between worlds, about ascending through preparation, about the 7 who watch and the 8th who comes, using language that sounded more like ceremonial magic than like biblical prophecy. Where Samuel encountered these ideas, whether through books he obtained, through contact with someone who practiced esoteric traditions, or through his own imagination, is unknown, but they clearly influenced his thinking and the ritual practices he developed. Samuel's final writings, dated to the days immediately before the family's deaths, showed complete certainty that the anticipated event was imminent. He wrote that the signs were clear, that everything he had been told in his visions was coming to pass, that his family was ready and would be taken when the time came. He wrote a final entry on what appeared to be November 2nd, the day before Robert McIntyre's visit, that stated simply, "Tomorrow, they are here, the door opens. We will be transformed." This suggested that Samuel believed whatever he was expecting would occur on November 3rd, and that the family's final dinner on that date was intended as the culminating ritual that would facilitate their transformation or ascension. Whether Samuel genuinely believed these visions were real, or whether he had descended into complete psychosis that prevented him from distinguishing his internal mental experiences from external reality, is impossible to determine. The progression of his writing suggests a gradual deterioration of his mental state over the 3 years of isolation, with his thinking becoming increasingly disorganized, his beliefs becoming more grandiose and delusional, and his grip on consensus reality weakening until he was living almost entirely in a world of apocalyptic visions and magical thinking that bore little resemblance to the world around him. What is clear is that Samuel had the power to impose his delusions on his entire family, to convince or coerce them into accepting his beliefs and participating in his rituals despite the obvious cost to their well-being and ultimately their lives. This power came partly from his position as patriarch in a culture that gave fathers absolute authority over their families, partly from the family's complete isolation, which meant there were no alternative voices or perspectives to challenge Samuel's teachings, and partly from whatever psychological techniques of control and manipulation Samuel employed to ensure compliance from his wife and children. The children, particularly the younger ones, had no framework for understanding that their father's beliefs were abnormal or dangerous. They had been raised almost entirely within the closed system of Samuel's apocalyptic worldview, had been taught from earliest consciousness that the outside world was evil and that their family was specially chosen for divine purposes. They had no education beyond what Samuel provided, no contact with other children or adults who might have offered different perspectives, no opportunity to develop independent critical thinking that might have allowed them to question what they were being taught. Mary Hutchinson's role remains more ambiguous. She had been an adult when she married Samuel, had lived 19 years in the normal world before the family's isolation began, and presumably had some capacity to recognize that Samuel's behavior was becoming increasingly disturbed and dangerous. But whether she shared his beliefs, whether she was psychologically dominated and controlled by him, or whether she recognized the danger but felt powerless to protect herself and her children, cannot be determined from the available evidence. Some neighbors who had known Mary before the isolation reported that she had seemed increasingly frightened and withdrawn in the months before the family completely cut off contact, suggesting she may have recognized that Samuel was mentally ill but felt trapped with no way to escape or get help. In the patriarchal culture of rural Appalachia in 1914, a woman had few options for leaving an abusive or mentally ill husband, particularly when she had 6 children and no independent means of support. Mary may have concluded that compliance with Samuel's demands, however irrational, was her only option for survival and for keeping her family together. The dynamics within the Hutchinson household during those 3 years of isolation can only be imagined based on the fragments of evidence that survived. The house would have been a closed world, with Samuel as the absolute authority, his word as law, his interpretations of divine will as unquestionable. The children would have been raised in an atmosphere of constant religious instruction, probably with physical punishment for any questioning or disobedience, with their entire worldview shaped by Samuel's teachings about the imminent apocalypse and their special role in it. The nighttime rituals that neighbors reported, the lights moving in patterns, the chanting in unknown languages, the family standing outside in the darkness, suggest that Samuel had developed elaborate ceremonial practices that the entire family was required to participate in. These rituals probably intensified as November 1914 approached, and Samuel became more convinced that the prophesied transformation was imminent. The family's participation in these rituals, whether willing or coerced, would have reinforced Samuel's authority and would have created shared experiences that bound the family together in their isolated apocalyptic worldview. The final meal, the dinner at which the family died, was clearly understood by Samuel and probably by the rest of the family as something more than just eating. The ritual markings on the floor, the specific positioning of family members, the ceremonial nature of the setting, all suggest this was intended as a culminating ritual, the final act of preparation before the anticipated transformation or ascension. Samuel had written that the door opens on November 3rd, and the family's gathering at the table with the ritual markings surrounding them was apparently meant to facilitate this opening. to make the family ready to pass through this door when it appeared. What the family expected to happen is unclear. Did they believe they would physically ascend to heaven? Did they expect to be transformed into different beings? Did they think Christ or angels would appear and take them away? Samuel's writings used vague language about transformation and transcendence that could be interpreted in multiple ways. It's possible that different family members understood the expected event differently, or that Samuel himself wasn't entirely clear about what form the divine intervention would take, only that he was certain it would occur. The question of whether the family's deaths were intentional, whether Samuel had planned a murder-suicide that he framed as religious transformation, or whether they were accidental, the result of some unforeseen factor that killed the family while they were engaged in what they thought would be a harmless ritual, cannot be definitively answered. The absence of detectable poison argues against intentional poisoning, but Samuel might have used a substance that wasn't identified by the limited toxicology available in 19. The peaceful positioning of the bodies suggests death came quickly without struggle, which could indicate either a very effective poison or some kind of collective psychological event. Some modern researchers have suggested that the family might have died from a combination of factors including extreme fasting, psychological stress, and possibly some form of environmental toxin or oxygen deprivation that wouldn't have been detected by 1914 medical examination. If the family had been fasting as part of their ritual preparation, if they were in states of extreme psychological tension and expectation, their bodies might have been physiologically vulnerable in ways that made them susceptible to death from factors that would not normally be lethal. The locked doors remain the most puzzling aspect of the case. If the family realized they were dying, why didn't anyone try to unlock a door and escape or call for help? If they died unexpectedly and suddenly, who locked the doors after they died? The most logical explanation is that the doors were locked before the fatal meal began, that Samuel had secured the house from inside as part of the ritual preparation, possibly to prevent interruption, or possibly because he believed that being enclosed in a sealed space was necessary for the transformation he expected to occur. This would mean that the family gathered at the table, knowing they were locked in, that no one could enter and no one could leave, that whatever was going to happen would happen in that enclosed space. Whether they understood this as part of a religious ritual, or whether they had some awareness that they might not survive the experience cannot be known. The children almost certainly didn't understand the full implications of what was happening. They would have trusted their parents and would have participated in what they had been told was a sacred ceremony, without comprehending that they might be participating in their own deaths. The broader question of culpability, whether Samuel Hutchinson was a murderer who killed his family under the guise of religious ritual, or whether he was a mentally ill man who genuinely believed he was saving his family through spiritual preparation, is complex and perhaps unanswerable. By conventional definitions, Samuel was certainly responsible for his family's deaths, even if he didn't intend to kill them, because his delusional beliefs and his absolute control over an isolated family created the conditions that led to their deaths. But whether he had the mental capacity to understand that his actions would result in death, whether he intended death or genuinely expected divine intervention, affects how we judge his actions morally, even if not legally. The impact of the Hutchinson tragedy on the broader community of Pocahontas County was profound and lasting. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism, about the importance of maintaining community connections, even for families that preferred isolation, and about the need for intervention when families showed signs of dangerous beliefs or behaviors. Churches in the area intensified their pastoral outreach, attempting to identify and help families that were becoming isolated or that were developing extreme beliefs that might lead to harm. Local authorities became more willing to investigate reports of unusual behavior or of families that were withdrawing from community contact, recognizing that such isolation could be a warning sign of dangerous situations developing. The Hutchinson case provided legal and moral justification for intervention in family situations that previously would have been considered private matters beyond the reach of public authority. While respect for family autonomy and religious freedom remained important values, the Hutchinson tragedy demonstrated that these values had limits, that society had some responsibility to protect vulnerable family members even when doing so meant intruding on family privacy. But the fundamental problems that had enabled the Hutchinson tragedy, that families in remote mountain locations could live in complete isolation if they chose to, that religious freedom meant people could hold and practice any beliefs they wanted as long as they didn't obviously harm others, and that identifying when eccentric religious beliefs crossed the line into dangerous delusion was extremely difficult remained largely unresolved. The Hutchinson case was an extreme example, but less extreme versions of family isolation and religious extremism continued to occur throughout Appalachia and rural America more broadly. The 6 Hutchinson children who died with their parents left no legacy except as victims of their father's religious mania and their family's extreme isolation. James, 16 years old at his death, had been old enough to potentially recognize that his father's beliefs were delusional and to potentially resist or escape, but had apparently been so psychologically controlled and indoctrinated that he could not or would not act independently to save himself or his siblings. The younger children, Sarah, 14, Robert, 12, Elizabeth, 9, Thomas, 6, and Ruth, 4, had been denied education, denied social development, denied any opportunity to form identities independent of their father's apocalyptic worldview. These children had lived their final 3 years in an increasingly closed and disturbed family system, participating in nighttime rituals they didn't understand, hearing constantly about an imminent apocalypse that would transform their lives, probably living in states of chronic fear and confusion as their father's behavior became more erratic and their family's isolation deepened. Their deaths represented not just the loss of 6 young lives, but the destruction of all the potential those lives contained, the people they might have become, the contributions they might have made, the families they might have raised, all erased because their father's mental illness went unrecognized and untreated until it was too late. Mary Hutchinson's death is perhaps the most tragic of all, because she had the awareness and capacity to recognize the danger her family was in, but apparently felt powerless to prevent the catastrophe that was developing. She had watched her husband descend into delusion, had participated in, or at least acquiesced to the isolation of her children, had apparently gone along with rituals and beliefs that part of her must have known were dangerous and wrong. Whether she acted out of genuine belief, out of fear of Samuel, out of learned helplessness after years of patriarchal control, or out of some combination of these factors, she ended up dying along with her children in a locked house during a ritual meal that she must have helped prepare, unable or unwilling to save herself or them. The Hutchinson farmhouse stood abandoned for many years after the deaths, gradually deteriorating as weather and time took their toll on the structure. Local people avoided the property, considering it cursed or haunted. Children were warned not to go near it. Adults who had to pass by the property on mountain trails reported feeling uncomfortable or frightened, describing sensations of being watched or of atmospheric oppression that made them want to leave the area quickly. Several people reported unusual phenomena around the abandoned house in the years following the deaths. Lights were seen moving on the property at night, similar to the lights that neighbors had reported during the family's final years. Sounds described as chanting or singing were occasionally heard coming from the direction of the house. Some people reported seeing figures standing near the house in arrangements that suggested the Hutchinson family, though when approached, the figures would disappear or would be revealed as shadows or natural features that had been misperceived in poor lighting. These reports were generally dismissed as imagination, as tricks of light and shadow in a location that had acquired a sinister reputation, or as the result of people's expectations creating experiences that confirmed their beliefs about the property being haunted. But the consistency of the reports and the similarity to phenomena that had been observed before the family's deaths created local legends that the Hutchinson property was genuinely haunted, that whatever Samuel had been trying to summon or contact in his rituals had somehow remained connected to that location. By the 1950s, the house had collapsed completely, leaving only scattered foundation stones and some weathered timber barely visible among the undergrowth that had reclaimed the cleared land. The forest gradually erased all traces of the Hutchinson farm, and by the late 20th century, only careful study of historical records and old photographs could establish where the property had been located. The land became part of a larger tract that was eventually incorporated into the Monongahela National Forest, with the specific site of the Hutchinson house becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. The case file documenting the Hutchinson deaths remained in the archives of Pocahontas County, occasionally consulted by researchers interested in unusual death cases, in religious extremism, or in Appalachian history. The writings that Samuel had left on the walls of his house were photographed and copied before the house collapsed, preserving his apocalyptic visions and ritual incantations for future study. These documents have been analyzed by religious scholars, by psychiatrists studying delusion and psychosis, and by historians interested in how mainstream Christianity could mutate into dangerous extremism under certain conditions. Modern psychiatric understanding would almost certainly diagnose Samuel Hutchinson with some form of psychotic disorder, possibly schizophrenia with religious delusions, possibly delusional disorder focused on religious themes. His writings show many characteristics typical of religious psychosis, including grandiose beliefs about special divine selection, elaborate delusional systems that reinterpret reality through apocalyptic frameworks, and progressive deterioration of reality testing as the delusion becomes more elaborate and more divorced from consensus reality. But psychiatric diagnosis, while useful for understanding Samuel's mental state, doesn't fully explain the Hutchinson tragedy. Samuel's beliefs, while extreme, were not entirely outside the range of religious ideas that were common in his time and place. Apocalyptic Christianity, beliefs about special divine revelation, expectations of Christ's imminent return, all were mainstream ideas in fundamentalist Protestant communities. Samuel took these ideas further than most, but the difference was one of degree rather than kind. This raises uncomfortable questions about where the line should be drawn between acceptable religious belief and dangerous delusion, and about how communities should respond when religious beliefs start leading toward isolation and potential harm. The Hutchinson case also raises questions about family dynamics and about how patriarchal authority can enable abuse and harm when combined with isolation and extreme beliefs. Samuel had absolute authority over his family, and Appalachian culture in 1914 provided few checks on that authority. Mary Hutchinson and the children had essentially no rights independent of Samuel, no ability to seek help without his permission, no legal or social mechanisms that would allow them to escape his control, even if they recognized it was dangerous. This power imbalance, combined with geographic isolation that prevented outside oversight, created conditions where Samuel's deteriorating mental state could lead to catastrophe without effective intervention. Modern child protection laws, domestic violence resources, and mental health intervention systems are designed partly to address the kinds of situations that led to the Hutchinson tragedy. Mandatory schooling means children cannot be completely isolated and controlled by parents. Domestic violence laws and resources mean spouses and children have options for escaping abusive households. Mental health crisis intervention means people showing signs of dangerous delusions can potentially be assessed and treated before harm occurs. But even with these systems, family tragedies resulting from extreme religious beliefs and parental control continue to occur, suggesting that the fundamental problems the Hutchinson case exemplified remain challenging to address. The question of what actually killed the Hutchinson family may never be definitively answered. The medical examination in 1914 was too limited to identify many potential causes of death. The bodies were buried shortly after the examination, making later more sophisticated analysis impossible. The physical evidence from the house was not preserved beyond photographs and written descriptions. We are left with a mystery that admits of multiple interpretations, but that cannot be conclusively solved with the information available. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Hutchinson case is not the specific details of how or why they died, but rather what their story reveals about the dangers of isolation, of unchecked parental authority, of religious beliefs that become so extreme they override normal human concerns for safety and survival, and of communities' responsibilities to intervene when families show warning signs of dangerous situations developing. The Hutchinson family did not die suddenly or without warning. Their tragedy developed over 3 years, during which numerous people observed concerning behaviors and expressed worries about what was happening in that isolated mountain farmhouse. But the interventions that occurred were too limited, too respectful of family autonomy and religious freedom, too constrained by legal and social norms that made it difficult to help people who seemed determined to isolate themselves. By the time the full extent of the danger became apparent, it was too late. 8 people were dead in a locked house, victims of beliefs that promised transformation and salvation, but that delivered only death in mysterious circumstances that remained disturbing and unexplained more than a century later. The photographs of the Hutchinson family that survive from before their isolation show them as ordinary mountain people, Samuel stern, but not obviously disturbed, Mary somewhat sad-eyed but not frightened, the children typical of their time and place. There is nothing in these images that would predict the trajectory their lives would take, nothing that would suggest this family would end up dead at a ritual dinner table in a locked house while the patriarch's apocalyptic writings covered the walls around them. This ordinariness makes their story more disturbing rather than less so, because it demonstrates how quickly and completely normal family life can deteriorate into tragedy when mental illness, isolation, and extreme beliefs combine in dangerous ways. The site where the Hutchinson farmhouse once stood is now indistinguishable from the surrounding West Virginia forest. Trees grow where the house and fields once were. No marker indicates that 8 people lived and died there under circumstances that remain mysterious. Hikers occasionally pass through the area without knowing its history. The Hutchinson family has been forgotten by all except historians and researchers who study unusual death cases or Appalachian history. Their tragedy is preserved only in archived documents and in occasional articles or books that examine mysterious deaths or religious extremism. But for those who study the case carefully, who read Samuel Hutchinson's deteriorating writings and the testimony of neighbors who watched the family's isolation deepen, who examine the evidence from that locked house where 8 people died simultaneously for reasons that modern medicine still cannot definitively explain, the Hutchinson tragedy remains profoundly disturbing. It asks questions about the nature of religious belief and delusion, about family dynamics and parental authority, about community responsibility and the limits of intervention, about whether the family's deaths could have been prevented if different choices had been made by the people who observed their concerning behavior. It also asks questions about what Samuel Hutchinson actually believed was going to happen on November 3rd. Did he expect literal divine intervention, Christ appearing, angels descending, a door opening to another realm? Did he believe the ritual meal would trigger transformation that would allow the family to ascend or transcend normal physical existence? Or did he, in some part of his mind that remained rational even as delusion consumed most of his thinking, understand that he was orchestrating his family's deaths and simply framing it as religious salvation to make it psychologically bearable? The final image from the Hutchinson case, 8 people seated at a table, dead but positioned as if alive, surrounded by ritual markings in a locked house, remains one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history, even though no crime could be proven or charged. Whether the family died by Samuel's design, by accident of some undetected environmental factor, or by some form of collective psychological event that allowed belief to overcome survival instinct and cause death, the result was the same. 8 lives ended, a family destroyed, a mystery created that persists unsolved after more than a century. The mountains of West Virginia still harbor isolated families living in remote valleys and on steep slopes, maintaining ways of life that have changed little in generations. Most of these families live peacefully and harmlessly, their isolation representing choice and tradition rather than danger. But the Hutchinson case serves as a permanent reminder that isolation can enable tragedy, that extreme beliefs can lead to catastrophic outcomes, and that communities have responsibility to notice warning signs and to attempt intervention even when doing so is difficult or uncomfortable. Samuel Hutchinson's final writing, "Tomorrow. They are here. The door opens. We will be transformed," carries different meanings depending on how we understand what happened. If we view it as the words of a delusional man who genuinely believed divine intervention was imminent, it becomes tragic, a record of hope that was horribly misplaced. If we view it as the words of a man planning to kill his family while framing it as religious transcendence, it becomes chilling, evidence of manipulation and murder disguised as faith. If we view it as somehow prophetic or accurate, if we entertain the possibility that something did occur on November 3rd, 1914, that the family did experience some form of transformation or did pass through some door, then it becomes profoundly disturbing in different ways, suggesting realities beyond our normal understanding. Most likely, the truth lies in the tragic first interpretation. Samuel was mentally ill, his beliefs were delusional, and 8 people died because those beliefs went unchallenged and untreated, until they led to catastrophe. But the mystery of how they died, the locked doors, the absence of identifiable cause of death, the ritual preparation, all prevent complete certainty and leave room for the unsettling possibility that something occurred in that Appalachian farmhouse that cannot be fully explained by mental illness and family dysfunction alone. What do you think happened to the Hutchinson family? Was Samuel a mentally ill man whose delusions killed his family? Was it mass psychogenic death triggered by extreme religious belief? Could environmental factors have caused their simultaneous deaths without leaving detectable traces? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. The past is never truly buried. It's just waiting in the shadows.